The crucial review literature and set objectives are the essential feature of the research, and one should see all these things before proceeding for the research. Here, I congratulate Delhi team of RSC City branch and Dr. Navdeep, Dr. Rakesh, Dr. Rakhi, and Dr. Alok Kumar for presenting this webinar. Many congratulations. I also pay my gratitude to the patron and past presidents and to Dr. Naveen Malhotra and all executive of our RSB society. All they are working well to just started these academic activities, and we are going in right direction. I also welcome and pay my regards to the all participants who are participating in this webinar. Thank you very much. With best regards.
Thank you, sir. And now I invite our patron, Dr. Tej K. Kaul, sir, to say a few words. Dr. Kaul, sir.
Good evening and welcome to this academic webinar series 2020 of RSSCP. This is the second webinar of 2020. I must thank the GC, particularly its president and the secretary, to allow such things to happen. It is very essential for RSSCP to continue such academic programs for percolation and dispensation of knowledge, particularly to the younger generation. RSSCP stands primarily for enhancement and encouragement of research besides many other activities. Today's topic, the clinical research, aptly suits to the webinar of RSSCP. The speakers are all very learned people, dynamic people, intelligent person. I am sure that this second series of this webinar is bound to be very interesting for all generations of the anesthesiologists, rather all medical specialties. I thank the speakers, Major General Navdeep Sethi, Colonel Rakhi, Dr. Rakesh, Colonel Alok Kumar, for taking all pains to enlighten us the methodologies, how to formulate, how to conduct, and the statistical tools, etc. of research. None of my addresses in RSSCP goes without thanks to the dynamic Naveen Malhotra. His personality, his thinking, his dynamism, everything associated with him is unique, unbelievable, and I wish him the best of luck for all future ventures. I wish RSSCP grows many folds, and without wasting further time, I hand over to the speakers to proceed with the webinar. Best wishes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you
Long
for
live
your
RSSCP.
long live. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your good wishes and blessings. A few words from our Vice President, Dr. Sarvari Swaika. If she is, please unmute yourself. Probably she has some internet issues. So, thank you, sir, and congratulations to our Delhi team, the webinar chairpersons. And yes, sir has very rightly said that the name of our society signifies research. and hence this webinar, the topic and theme is very apt in accordance with our Research Society of Anesthesiology Clinical Pharmacology. And I hope this webinar will be very useful for postgraduates, senior residents, young faculty, as well as freelance practitioners also. So best wishes to all the speakers and the delegates, the office bearers of Research Society of Anesthesiology Clinical Pharmacology, the past presidents, patron sir, the GC members. Thank you very much. Long live RSSAP. I hand over to Major General Navdeep Sethi to please carry out the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma, Dr. Kaul, Dr. Savary, Dr. Naveen, and team RSACP for giving us the opportunity to organize this monsoon webinar. The rains have been playing hooky in Delhi, but I can assure you none of our speakers is going to do that. So, coming to the topic, research, as you all know, is veritably the linchpin of all medical practice, including anesthesiology, which makes research methodology the most basic of skills to be acquired by all anesthesiologists. From thesis writing as a postgraduate to writing scientific papers as an imperative for becoming a professor and reviewing peer-written material, the importance of research cannot be overemphasized. In today's COVID times, when scientific papers are being churned out at breakneck speed, especially in the West, and being accepted by even leading medical journals by often short-circuiting peer review, it becomes even more important to stress on correct research techniques, because this ensures that our articles stand up to scientific scrutiny and they are not embarrassingly retracted sometimes later on. Today's webinar is aimed primarily at our postgraduates and younger colleagues, but it may prove as a useful refresher for most of us. Our three speakers today are all accomplished in their own field. Dr. Rakesh Garg from AIIMS, Delhi, will be dealing with formulation of a research question and hypothesis. Dr. Rakhi Goel from Rainbow Children's Hospital will be touching upon research methodology. Dr. Alok Kumar from Army Hospital RNR would be describing the scientific statistical tools available to us. I would like to reiterate that we will be stressing on the basics of medical research methodology only. So, without further ado, over to our first speaker, Dr. Rakesh Garg.
Thank you so much, sir. I would request all the participants to meet their speakers, please.
Dr. Rakesh, I will suggest you mute everybody and don't allow them to unmute till the queries.
Right, sir. So we'll be discussing about one of the important aspects of research. The first and foremost thing is when we start thinking of a research, we have to think of a research question with a workable hypothesis for it. And this remains the stem, this remains the root, and this remains the leaves of further process of method and statistical analysis. So we need to understand this very well. If the research question is good, obviously its acceptability, the process of planning, and subsequent its clinical translation would be very, very good. I bring greetings from the Research Society of Anesthesiology and Clinical Pharmacology, as well as AIIMS, where I work at. So when we talk of a research question, every research project, whatever we think of, whether it's an interventional or a non-interventional, whether it's a comparative versus a non-comparative, it starts with what you need to realize in your clinical practice that does not seem to achieve the desired outcomes. For example, we want that something we are interfering or intervening into a patient management to give them a good pain relief without side effects. But we observe that in a clinical practice, 1 out of 10 patients get a side effect. So this means there is something lacking into our clinical practice which needs to be researched for. And that is what we need research, and that is for what we need a research question. And also it is a quest for a newer practice. We were using thiopentone for some time. We were using for say propofol sometime, but then we are still thinking of whether we have an agent which is absolutely a very good anesthesia induction agent without the side effect, without the hemodynamic profile. And that is the quest for newer practice when new molecules are being researched across the globe. And this is what needs to turn a clinical problem, a clinical lacuna, or a clinical need into a research question. And that is how the research starts with. Any question that needs answer can be a research problem. So you have to identify that in your clinical practice, along with your colleagues at your center, what are those problems? And that needs to be translated or transformed into something specific, which has its some components which we'll be discussing, and then to be framed into a research question. And herein I said, when we say we are looking for a research question, what matters is your knowledge in the research methodology. Now, it's a common belief that the awareness of research is only for the researchers. This is not correct. Every clinician, every reader should be aware of the basics of research methodology, which RSACP has taken an initiative, and this is putting forward. Then your knowledge in the subject area and your understanding of the issues to be examined. Sometimes we feel that the things are there, but we are not able to get a good outcome, but maybe that we are not using in the correct way it is used to be. So this may not be a clinical problem for a new molecule, but this will be a clinical molecule for a new technique so that you get a good outcome with the same molecule. The sources of research question would be from the previous research. Now, whenever you read a research, there will be the last paragraphs in the discussion section where they mention that the future research needs to be done on this parameter. And this depends upon the researcher, what they have found from their studies, though it was not the primary objective for it, but they observed something new and they put it forward that this needs further research. Maybe new ideas or technologies. That's why we need to be well versed with the latest research going around the world. Maybe we have some new equipment. Maybe we have some new molecule. Maybe we have some new technique that will be helping us to have some good, meaningful outcome of our clinical work. Or maybe from the clinical observation. We are all clinicians working in the operation theater, in the pain clinics, in the intensive care unit. If you found that, yes, you are doing it as per the standards, but still there is something lacking, that could be a source of a research question. The teaching and the variability in clinical practice can also be put into comparative mode, and we can compare whether my teaching practice as compared to the other one, which is better. And this is how we come up with a research question as well. So having said that, what we need to is when we start thinking of a research question, start thinking of absolute some very meaningful aim and objective. And the study usually have a general objective which is set based on the course research question of the study. And that is very important, how the studies progresses further. And when you decide your objectives, it should be very clear. And we can remember this SMART mnemonic, which requires that when we think of a research question, the aim subsequently to it, it has to be very specific, focusing on a particular area of interest. It should be measurable because in research, we want to measure something. The subjectivity has gone up. We have to bring objectivity, and that measurability is one of the important contributor of any research methodology. It should be attainable. It should be relevant and should be time framed. Maybe I'm not going to start a study in which my recruitment will be there for the next 50 years, because the 50 years, the things will change on. So it has to be a time frame. The research question is again very important for appropriate protocol writing, because at times you'll be requiring the research grant from somebody or the ethical clearance. So they should be very crystal clear that what exactly are you looking from your study. It helps us to make a study design, which will be coming a little later in the subsequent. But how can you do a good method section? And this is the research question based on which you can design a good method for your study. It helps in guiding analysis and decision making, because if you know that this is your research question, this is your objective, the analysis needs to be decided based on this. It's ensure better chances of publication, because we do research, we want that everybody should be helped for it, and we publish it into a journal for publication. The publication editors and reviewers obviously will look for the robustness of the research question that you have set for. And getting a right question increases the likelihood of finding a correct solution. And that's the most important thing while you're deciding for a research question. When we say a research question, what are the attributes for it? It should be something novel into it. It should be some innovative into a research question. It is approachable and answerable. At times, we can think of a research question which may not be doable. It will be not approachable. You will require something which is not available to you. So this is not a correct attribute of a good research question. It should be interesting to an investigator. It should be relevant to the scientific knowledge, clinical care, or the health policy. And it is going to either reiterate the existing knowledge or put in some food for thought for the future research. Having said that, everything should be in the umbrella of ethics, which is the core principle of doing any research. Now, this is one of the important slides I would like to put up here, that the research, I said, there should be a research question. Sometimes we feel that we are doing a study, why not to study this, why not to study that, why not to look for this outcome? So we start thinking of multiple parameters. And when we start having multiple parameters, outcome parameters, the study can go haywire. So it is always good in the today's condition that think of a single primary research question. But if you think that there are some additional attributes to a research question which is essential, maybe a significant side effect or significant some other outcome, you can club them into secondary questions. So when we think of a research question, think this mnemonic, and this will be helping you a lot in deciding on good research question for your study. And the mnemonic goes as FINER criteria. FINER means we need to think of its feasibility, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. What I mean by feasibility is that the sufficient resources that you require for conduct that study, or the manpower, or the equipment, or the drugs should be available to you. And that is what the feasibility is in your surrounding. Or you will be able to arrange it from some other sources. It should be interesting. Suppose my research interest is into the onco-anesthesia, so I should be looking for some area into the onco-anesthesia or the pain medicine so that I can do something into it. And I'm already involved into my research area, my interesting area, so I'll be able to put my efforts, my time into it. It should be novel. If something is known, why not? Why to do it? So something should be new finding from a research, because remember that you are exposing a patient as a subject into a research. So there should be some novelty, and that guidelines also says the ethicality of your research question. It should be following the ethical guidelines, and that's why for the safety of research, almost all institutes have some internal ethics review committee or ethical committee that needs to follow those guidelines which are being provided by them. It should be relevant. So whatever outcome we are looking for should be having some clinical translational value. And that is the most important thing. For example, if we talk of like nowadays also we are using zinc, and zinc is one of the very component for diarrhea management. So somebody find that the zinc administration to a patient of diarrhea reduces the chances of the adverse effect of diarrhea. So it was a landmark study, but then it has a direct translation value, and that has even come into the policy. Similarly, in anesthesia practice, we have many things which has direct clinical translation and needs to be looked for. So once we are sure that the FINER criteria has been taken up, we can look for the PICOT. Now, these are the components of the research question that needs to be there. PICOT stands for the population, intervention, control arm, outcome, and timing of measurement. Now, when we say the PICOT, the research question should comprise of all the 5 components of the PICOT. The population should be defined. That what population? Are we taking patients from 18 to 45 years of age? Are we going to take pediatric patients from, say, newborn to 14 years? That needs to be justifiable. Now, when we say, the study selection or the study population is important, we should understand that the homogeneity in the population is important because the outcome will be affected by it. For example, the pain assessment. The pain assessment tool would be different for a newborn baby of 1 day as compared to 12-year-old child. Both comes into a category of pediatrics, but then the pain assessment tool, the pain requirement, the technique probably would be different, and that's why we need to define the study population. The intervention, it could be a test, it could be a therapy, it could be a medication, it could be a technique. It needs to be well defined. Now, whenever we say that something is better than the other, we need to compare from somebody, and that is what the control arm is. And this control arm could be the gold standard, or it could be the standard of care or the usual standard. The outcome parameters. Now, these are the important things. We need to be a priori thinking of the primary outcome parameters, and they should be predefined very objectively so that we are able to define them and observe them and then subsequently do analysis so that we get some robust outcome. The timing of measurement. Again, this is important. We need to time describe the duration for data collection, the duration of the drug administration or something like this. They needs to be well defined from in your research question. Let's see some example. Population, you need to, as I mentioned earlier, it should be defined as infants, adults, geriatric, male, female, or type of surgery. The intervention should be clear. It could be drug, it could be technique. The control group should be standardized as a standard technique. It could be a gold standard. Now, I just want to point out here the placebo group. Now, sometimes we think of a placebo group is important, but it's not necessary for all patients. For example, we want to look the analgesic effect of some new drug. Then we cannot say that one group will receive analgesic, second group will not give any analgesic till the pain happens. So this is not correct because of ethical reasons. So placebo is nowadays not very frequently used. What we are using is either a standard therapy or a conventional technique. And most important or most better will be a gold standard. But sometimes we do not have a gold standard. So in those situations, we can think of the usual care for these patients. And that is what needs to be taken care of, that the patient should not be devoid of the routine care while the study is going on, even if you think it's a control group. The outcome parameters could be quantitative versus qualitative. That depends upon your research question itself. And we'll discuss more in method section by Dr. Raki Goyal. It could be blood pressure, it could be visual analog scale, it could be pain, it could be Ramsay sedation score in the ICU. So whatever the parameters are, you need to define them a priori. And the time is important, the duration of measurement, the duration of the intervention. So all those needs to be defined into the research question. Now, why this PICOT is important for us? It enhances the quality of thought process. So you're clear that this is population, this is intervention, this is control, this is the time frame. So you are almost very clear about your process in the form of a research question. It informs the design, it guides the analysis, it ensures publication, and obviously it associated with improved overall quality of reporting. And that's why the various studies, even the BMC Medical Research Methodology Journal, they mention that though people are aware of it, but still many of them are not reporting either of the PICOT components into the research question, which is very, very mandatory. To summarize, these are the 4 steps that needs to be followed while you are looking for the research question. Identify the research problem area from your clinical experience, from the published literature, from your colleague, or from your patient's feedback. And then based on it, you can think of a PICOT framed research question, which we have just discussed. All component of PICOT should be included into it. And then finally, focus on the research question and framed it. For example, in this example, I'll come to the next slide. And then finally, once you have a research question in the PICOT format, think of the finer criteria. It's feasible, it's interesting, it's novel, it's ethical and relevant. If all the criteria is fitted, this means you have reached the right research question, and then you can proceed with the method section. The Research question can be of various types, like interventional. You want to look for whether the administration of dexmedetomidine to a TAP block increases the analgesic efficacy. So intervening. The therapy. When you say addition of a particular drug, for example, in today's COVID, whether remdesivir is helping to improve the severity of a patients with COVID-19. So this would be a therapy. Prognosis or prediction. If a patient in the ICU, you want to say that if some patient manifests these symptoms, how much is the time, how much is the chance that patient will improve or patient will have a mortality? It could be a diagnostic test. It could be etiological. It could be meaning of some clinical translation value. So based on this, research question could be any, and this is what you need to follow that. And based on this, whatever the type of research question is, but remember, all the PICOT components must be there for a meaningful method section of it. Let's see this example. In adult patients undergoing elective surgery, does treatment with epidural analgesia in combination with acetaminophen and NSAID, which is the multimodal analgesic technique, compared with epidural alone, which is a single model lead to a better pain relief and less side effects over 24 cycles. So this is my research question. Let's see whether it has all the components. These are the various components of PICOT that I was discussing with you. And the PICOT components are, the P is adult patients undergoing elective surgery. So I've defined my population. It is not emergency surgery because the management will be different. Intervention is clear. Epidural analgesia with combination of acetaminophen and NSAID, multimodal analgesia. My comparative is the conventional care, which is the epidural alone. Outcome is pain relief, which will be defined further in the method section, objectively defined. And my time interval will be 24 hours following surgery. So this is how PICOT will take care of your research question. Let's see whether my research question fits the final criteria. Yes, it's feasible. I have a lot of patients who require the elective surgeries requiring epidural placement. It's interesting. Yes, I'm going to benefit whether the multimodal analgesia technique is much better. Is it novel? Probably yes. In my center, say if we are using epidural, so maybe the placement of multimodal will be better. Then you can proceed further whether adjuvant addition will be having some novelty to it. Ethical, yes, absolutely. We are not using any drug which is not indicated for these patients. Relevant, yes, it is relevant to my patient profile, my patient clinical parameter, because I want to give a good analgesia. Now, having said that, once we have a research question, we have to generate a hypothesis. Now, hypothesis is, when we say talk about hypothesis, now we are doing a study into a selected population, right? And then we are inferring that probably this is going to help the whole universe, the whole population. So hypothesis testing allows us to determine whether enough statistical evidence exists to conclude that a belief, which we say hypothesis, about a parameter is supported by the data from a study. So what we need to do is we have to clarify, we have to prove or disapprove the hypothesis, which we have designed based on the research question. And this is what, again, the hypothesis is based on research question. So it again follows the PICOT standards here. Now, when we say the research question and hypothesis, we think of two terms here, the null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. We believe when we base a research question, we say that probably the technique is not better. So we say it's a null hypothesis. So this means there is no statistically significant difference between the groups. So we say that this technique should be better. So in research, in analysis, we disapprove the null hypothesis and say definitely the intervention was better than the control group. Or there could be an alternate hypothesis where we say that there is a significant difference between the two groups with respect to outcome. So usually we follow the null hypothesis and disapprove in statistical analysis language and then prove that. So this is how we follow the step for testing hypothesis. Once research question is available, we state null and alternate hypothesis, choose a significance level, which is usually 0.05, but those studies where you want a very good precision, it could be 0.01 as well. You determine the rejection region and the acceptance regions, that this is the domain where you say that your null hypothesis is accepted or rejected. And based on the sample, calculate the statistical analysis test will be discussed and compare it with the critical values and make a decision based on the acceptance or rejection of hypothesis and state your conclusion. So this is how we use in the method section to prove or disapprove hypothesis based on the research question. So to summarize, when we say the research question and hypothesis, the establishing a research question is crucial for planning an outcome of study. Study should usually have a single primary research question, but if required, a couple of secondary questions, but they should be minimum. Always remember, SMART, FINER, and PICOT are helping hands for framing a good research question. Thank you so much. Now, I'll hand over to our next speaker, Dr. Rakhi Goyal, who will be talking about the study methodology. So when I said that we have already created a research question, it has to be put into the format of a method, and which is again very important. The method should be in such a way that the research question, whatever we have done in PICOT format, is applicable and we get some outcome data. So over to Dr. Rakhi Goyal now.
Thank you, Dr. Rakesh. Thank you, RSSCP, Dr. Kaul, Dr. Naveen, and everyone from RSSCP. Now let me start, ladies and gentlemen, with a truth. I'm not a statistician, and by the end of the webinar, we don't expect any of our participants to be a statistician either. But the whole idea of this webinar is that we all get over the scare that we usually have when we even think of a research. The moment we, especially from our country, when we think of a research, we get scared and we think that this is something that we don't understand and it's impossible. So the whole idea of this webinar, to make it simple, to make it doable. Now coming to the strength of a study, can I please request the participants to switch off their speakers and the video. What is the strength of any study, any research project? It is the methodology, how well you design, how well you I'm not able to proceed. Can you please mute your speakers?
Dr. Rakhi, you mute everybody.
Madam, can you just unmute yourself? Dr. Rakhi, can you just unmute yourself?
Yeah, we are good now. All right. So in a very simple manner, I would take you through this journey of study methodology, how you plan and how you progress. We begin with the regulations, because there are a lot of ethical issues in our clinical studies. So we must know about the regulations that prevail at present times. In India, it is the Indian Council of Medical Research, the ICMR, that promotes and regulates all biomedical research. The Drugs Controller General of India, the DCGI, it controls all the drug trials. When it comes to an institution, a hospital where we are going to conduct the research, we have the Institution Ethics Committee. It's also called Institutional Review Board by many. If your hospital or your institution does not have an ethics committee, there could be an external ethics committee. ICMR has independent ethics committee which are registered and can be used by people who do not have an institution ethics committee. We must know this so that nobody in the country is deprived of initiating a research because of the lack of an approved and registered ethics committee. Next is the Clinical Trial Registry of India. Now this again is very important. Like in the US, we have the clinicalregistries.gov. In India, we have the Clinical Registry of India, CTRI. I will take you through the portal. This is a simple portal. All of us, when we plan a research, when we design a research, we must register ourselves with CTRI. You just need a username and a password, and you register yourself. And when you start your first research project, this is the front page that comes. It asks for a public title because it's in a public domain. The entire research, the methodology that you submit would be in a public domain. This is the ethical issues, and the CTRI, the registration is to protect the rights of the subjects, the participants of the study. Because in our setup, the participants are humans. They could be volunteers, they could be patients. To protect their rights and do an ethical studies, authenticate the data, it is important that these regulatory bodies have these forms, and all researchers, all participants must abide by the rules and regulations. Now, any study, if it is systematic, if it is planned, and if it's aimed to find the correct information of a new info, it will be simple. It's only when we don't understand the step-by-step process that we make it complicated, and then we get scared of it. So the basis of a study should always be simple, very objective. It cannot be subjective. The results, the conclusions are always better when the study approach is objective. Any study should be reliable and repeatable. With the same methodology, if you do a study again, it should come up with similar results. So it should be objective, reliable, and repeatable. A simple difference between methodology and methods is often confused. Methodology is the philosophical stance, how you see the world, whereas method is the step-by-step process of data collection. Study design, it could be quantitative or qualitative. Usually in our clinical scenario, we have quantitative data. So our study designs are commonly quantitative, which could be either experimental or observational. Observational, easy to do. It could be retrospective, it could be prospective. But when you register a trial, the registry of the trial is always prospective, means in advance, before the recruitment of the first patient or first candidate, participant. However, observational studies per se can look back into any data which is retrospective. We are quite familiar with the experimental studies, like the RCTs, the randomized controlled trial. We'll talk about the individual components separately. Now, why do we need a control for a study? We always have a test and a control. The control is required because test alone may not be able to give you the right results. So at the initial stage, when you're planning a study, you should always think of a control. A control could be just a placebo, another drug, another intervention with a slightly different dosages regimen, or you could have the gold standard in that treatment as a control. It takes away the bias. It takes away the bias in the form of Hawthorne effect, where because you are a participant of a study, you get very perturbed about it. Or suppose you have to check the blood pressure of a patient. Now, if the patient knows that he is under a study, his blood pressure may increase automatically, and this may cause a difference in your study result. So a control is required, and it could be selected in either which way. These studies and control studies could be superior, inferior, or equivalent. So the studies are called, when you design a study, you decide, is it going to be a superiority study? Meaning one method is superior to the other. That's your hypothesis. And at the end of the study, you are going to find whether it was true or not. Non-inferiority, is it not inferior to the known method or your control, or equivalent? So this you may bring up at the time of designing the study. Also, what is important is, what is your study population? You should be clear. In our setting, again, our study population is commonly our patients. In India, we do not do volunteers, we do on our patients, but you have to clearly define. Like in anesthesia, if you are defining your population, they are your patients coming in for surgery. How do you select your patients? You are not going to do a study on all the patients that come for surgery. So your kind of selection, suppose they come for lap cholecystectomy. So you are restricting only those patients who come for lap cholecystectomy. So you do a patient selection. You also do a patient selection on the basis of age, weight, other factors, surgery, kind of anesthesia you're giving, or so on and so forth. Third is the study area. This should always be predefined. When you make your study protocol, you should define what is your study area? Where are you planning to do this study? You can't have a ill-defined place. You should know in a tertiary care hospital, in a multi-specialty hospital, in one hospital, or in more than one. If you're looking at a multi-centric trial, then individual institution should have the ethics clearance as well, separate ethics clearance based on the same protocol. Next is the study period. Now, if you can define the study period, it would be very good. Commonly over 1 year, over 2 years. So you can always extend your study period if you're not able to finish in that period, but it's a good idea to always define your study period in the beginning. And the most important is the sample size. The sample size needs to be calculated before you start the study. So it is in the planning stage that you need to calculate the sample size. This shows a simple flow of events, how it goes when you design a study and how you plan a study. So first you define a target population. Then as I discussed, you identify the study population, that of all the patients coming for surgery, which are the patients you will include in your study group. So they become the study participants in particular. Okay, from this age, this gender, this particular inclusion criteria, I will put them in my study. So you have study participants, you have study non-participants. So they get excluded. We'll come to the inclusion and exclusion criteria separately. Then comes the process of randomizing them into groups. You have to allocate them groups. So it could be a study intervention group or a study control group. So it has to be done systematically. Randomization through a known method, then allocation to a particular group. Then there would be whatever intervention you have planned, whatever drug, some intervention, or just observation of the data, then you have the outcome measures. When you collect all this data, you analyze them, you compare them using the appropriate statistical tools, and then comes the results which you interpret for clinical application. So this is overall in just the flow of a study that you plan to do. Now, at the look of it, randomization may appear very confusing. Probability sampling, non-probability sampling, but we need not go into the details. A simple method of randomization is through a computer-generated randomization table. I think if we just stick to that, you go to any of the randomization tables, there are a whole lot of softwares available on the internet. You just type randomization table and you will get options where you can put, you want 2 groups, you want 3 groups, whichever way you want, it will ask you, and you can have a computer generated randomization. The whole idea of randomization is to decrease the bias, that you are randomly selecting patients or your subjects or your participants for a group. So this can be very, very easily done through a computer generated randomization table. So the sequence, you know, okay, my first patient comes, it goes in group A, suppose. Second comes, goes in group B. So it's not A, B, C, D. It could be A, D, B, A, and in any such random fashion. This has to be known before the start of the study. Now, randomization is not allocation. Allocation is once you know the table, you know now one by one when your subjects come, how will you allocate them the group. Now, this is ideally supposed to be blinded. So another person who is not directly the part of study can always have sequentially numbered 1, 2, 3, 4 like that envelopes. This is the simplest method to follow allocations concealment. You have the envelopes. In the envelope, when he opens number 1, he says, okay, group A. So that particular patient is going to be put in group A by the investigator, which means the investigator will follow the protocol meant for group A, whichever it is, the test, the control, doesn't matter. But this is all blinded. The randomization number, the allocation number. So the person who is randomizing doesn't know the allocation. The person who is allocating probably doesn't know the group where the patient is going. The investigator only opens the protocol, follows the protocol, executes it depending on the group given to him. Now, blinding. I've already said a bit of blinding. Now, blinding is neither randomization nor concealment allocation. It is blinding, which means who are the stakeholders in this blinding? The investigator, the participant, and the person who is evaluating the data analyzer. So because there could be a bias, if I'm investigating and I know that I'm using one drug, the test drug, so I will be biased when I'm investigating. If the patient knows, if the participant on whom we are doing the study, if he knows that he's getting a control group, he's just getting a placebo, he's not getting the test drug, he or she again may be biased. So it's always better to have a blinded study. Now, blinding is not possible in every study. You can have a single blind, double blind, triple blind. It's not possible every time. Suppose I'm using propofol. It's a white color drug. And comparing it with thiopentone, they look so different. Obviously, even if you don't tell me, I will know. So in some methods, it's not blinded. So that goes into the limitation of your study. When you write an article, when you write the manuscript for publication, it should be very clear. What kind of blinding could you perform during your study? Was it an unblinded study that everybody knew what's going on? Single blinded and only one of the three stakeholders didn't know? Double blinded, two didn't know? Triple blinded? It's all self-explanatory. And if it could not be done, then it becomes a limitation of the study. There is no harm. The study is not going anywhere. It's just that you are admitting that it was a limitation of your study. Another very important thing, in the process of, in the excitement of doing blinding, we should not do unethical practice. Suppose I'm giving a block. Now, in another person without the block, I want to see the pain scores. So I will not put the needle in the control group just for the sake of blinding. I may use the drugs made in similar volume, similar looking, but I will not use intervention which could be unethical. So that is very important. Now, outcomes or the variables. We do a study only to find something. Now, to find something, we must be very clear. What do we want to find? There has to be one primary outcome, well defined. And this is right at the stage of aims and objectives of the study, the research question. That what is my primary objective? It cannot be, I want to see the effects of blood pressure, heart rate, respiration, nausea, vomiting, not everything. It has to be one clearly defined. Like if I say heart rate, so I must know when do I want to see the heart rate, in what form. Every detail should be objective. So primary outcome should be measurable, interpretable, sensitive to the objective of the study, clinically relevant, and their measurement timing must be clearly defined. At what times of the study, usually the baseline, and thereafter at what intervals which are clinically significant, you want to measure those variables. Now, what the sample size also at this stage, you should know that the sample size clearly is based on this primary outcome and not on the secondary outcomes. Secondary outcome means, like typically in the studies that we do in anesthesia, suppose we do any study based on efficacy, we will have some clinical outcomes like nausea, vomiting, pain, discomfort, itching, hypertension. So they are all the secondary outcomes, which a lot of data comes during your study, but that was not your primary outcome. So sample size is based only on the primary outcome. Now, there are different kinds of biases that may come into your study and may weaken your study. So these are the systematic deviation of the real or the true effect of your study. They could be at the investigator level, evaluator bias, performance bias, selection, information, allocation. Basically, at every stage of your study, there could be some bias. So the whole effort should be to minimize as far as possible, as far as ethically doable, to minimize these biases. Confounding. There can always be some confounding factor coming into your study. Suppose a diabetic patient, you're seeing sugars, but this may also have effect on hypertension. A diabetic may be hypertensive, it will affect in your primary or the secondary outcomes. So that could be a confounding factor. You must always try to minimize or prevent the confounding factors. If at all you cannot, then during your statistical analysis, these can be adjusted. There are methods in the statistical analysis that help us to adjust these confounding factors. Now, coming to the study tools, when you actually start planning a study, the study tools are the measurement scales, the questionnaires, the scoring systems. These days, during the lockdown, we've seen very many questionnaires coming up. Easy to form and easy to circulate. A lot of data comes through these questionnaires. Otherwise, routinely in anesthesia, in ICU, we have these measurement scales and scoring systems. Now, these have to be, you have to make sure that they're appropriate and clearly defined. How you're going to measure, what are you going to check? And most importantly, they should be validated. The strength of your study, as I said in the beginning, is in the methodology, in the step-by-step methods that you use. Each small part is extremely important, and it should not be converted into the weak link in your chain of study. So what is validity and what is the reliability of these study tools? How accurate is your measure is the validity. That if you're using some particular tool to measure a particular outcome, a variable, then this measure should be accurate. It should be very accurate. Otherwise, your whole study will have a poor basis. What is reliability? It is the consistency of that measure. It should be, when I repeat this test, when I repeat this, it should come the same, not different. So validity can be assessed by checking how well the results correspond to the established theories and the other measures. Now, a valid measurement is generally reliable. It can be repeated and found with the same result, but the vice versa may not be true. This we have already done. Now coming to data collection. Now we should be very clear how we collect our data, who collects our data. Again, one is the blinding part that we already discussed, how we should do the blinding when we collect the data. In most of our studies, it should not be the person who is investigating or who is doing the intervention. Suppose we have some data to be collected, say after intubation, at the time of laryngoscopy and intubation, you want to check, say, heart rate, blood pressure, the response. So if the person, there should be one person doing the intervention, and there should be somebody else who does not know which protocol is this, what drugs were given. He or she should be collecting the data, and he should know the complete protocol, the data timeline. You could have primary data and secondary data. So primary data is what you collect from your intervention or the drug you have given. Secondary data is what you already know on the basis of previous studies. If one study which is already published and tells you that the incidence of so-and-so thing is this, or the heart rate response to laryngoscopy is this. So you already have some known fact. So that you can quote as the secondary data. So the two types of data: primary, what you provide for the first time, original data, and secondary, what's already known in the literature. Now, some hospitals or institutions can also have a data monitoring committee. This is an added privilege, so it adds to the data and safety management, and there could be a lot of electronic data coming to a central station so that there is more authenticity to the data which is collected. And the last is the data compilation, which means after you collect the data in whichever form, manual form or from the central station, you are putting it in on paper, or in these days, every time it's on the MS Excel sheet. So on the Excel sheet, you put all the data, then you use the appropriate statistical tests, which Dr. Colonel Alok will discuss now, and use a software to analyze these data. So this is how you do your study. Now the last bit has to be the limitations of a study, how you accept or admit at the end of the study that these were my limitations. I think we should be very truthful in this, that sample size, it could be related to sample size, blinding, data collection, compilation, or analysis. We should be very clear, and we should admit this at the time of a study. So I finish here. I have tried to make it very simple and a step-by-step process of how we can actually perform a study which is well planned, which is systematic, which is objective, and which has true data done ethically in our own institution with the best of your ability and intention. So any questions to this, I would request the participants to put it in the chat box, and it can be taken later. I now invite the next speaker, Colonel Alok Kumar, and he's the cardiac anesthetist at Army Hospital RNR, and he's a keen researcher, and he'll take you through the different statistical tests that you could use. At least you should know those tests before you go to a statistician. You'll be better off if you know some of them. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So if So if people are still awake, I'll continue with the basics of statistical tools. It's too long now for a webinar, I believe, or for any lecture. But I will try to keep it very, very, very simple. And once, as my dear speakers have said, you have formulated your research question, you have done your methodology, you have made your protocol, you have registered yourself, have used the robust protocol, collected the data. Now it's time that you analyze those data. And which data will you choose? What tests will you choose? So the learning objectives of my lecture is to identify the data that you have. What preconditions are there to select any particular statistical test and apply the correct test to get the correct result. Because there are more than 100 tests available and it's very difficult to choose. Sometimes we are in six or two. Try things. There are a lot of caveats, lot of exceptions, think on them. Let's see if I am able to writing a test. What are you doing? What variables are there? Are they quantitative? Does your variable follow a normal distribution or is it very skewed? Are your categories, how many categories are there? Are there one group, two group, three groups, four groups? Are the data paired? I'll define one of every one of the questions because it's very important before you choose a statistical test that you know these answers for your data. So the first is to identify the variable that you have in hand or the data. So data can be quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative data are also called as continuous data, interval data, or ratios data. These data are obtained by measuring height, weight, age, blood pressure, which we come across in our clinical practices, or the number of reintubations, or the number of respiratory arrest. These are discrete data that can be counted upon. There could be data which are interval data, like a temperature scale, which has got equal intervals, or there is data like ratio, in which there is equal difference between scales. So these are all qualify as a quantitative data. Now there is another set which is qualitative data, which we generally come across as categorical data, also called as nominal data. So nominal or a categorical data are actually data which fits into categories like gender, male or female, pregnancy, yes or no, or even a proportions like a pregnancy rate 35%, or proportions of patients undergoing respiratory arrest 60%, things like that. These are categorical or nominal data, but a very subtle difference is these are unordered, and therefore there is another set of data called as ordinal data. Ordinal data are ordered data. These are categorical data which can be ordered, like pain, mild, moderate, severe, or you can rank them 1, 2, 3. So these are data which are which you have to identify which data are you dealing with, because the application of the test depends on it. Coming to the second question, which is your dependent and which is your independent variable. Independent variable is a variable that you change in your scientific experiment, or you control in a scientific experiments to test the effects. These are what you change. You can call it as a cause. And dependent variables are the effect, what you call as the effect, or what changes as a result of the application of an intervention or of a drug or anything else. So dependent is an effect, while independent is the cause. You must know this, because when you apply any statistical software, they ask for independent and dependent variable. And if you're confused in that, it's very difficult to apply a test. Coming to the next, third question, whether your data is paired or unpaired. I think it is the easiest to understand and the most common that we use in pairing or unpairing is pre and post test samples. Like you you apply a drug, give a drug, and you see pre drug application any effect and post drug any effect. So pre-post test samples, crossover trials, matched samples with another cohort. So these are paired data. They are equal in number, they are correlated to each other, and that is the essence of paired data, while any other data is unpaired data. And the last to understand is that whether your data follows a normal distribution or not. And how do you know? People generally write the normality of the distribution of the data was assessed by Kolmogorov, Smirnov test, and Shapiro-Wilk test. You will come across. It's the first line that you come across on whenever a paper explains a data. So what is this normal or abnormal distribution that we call as parametric or non-parametric test? It's very easy. You see, if you see your data and you do a histogram or you do a scatter plot or a PP plot or a QU plot, you will come to know whether your data is normally distributed or not. Let's say, for example, age of pediatric population, you have chosen from newborn to 14 years of age, and you plot the data, and you see that most of the population is less than 1 year of age, and very few are 14. So this is not a normal distribution of the data. So if you draw a histogram or a PP plot or a QQ plot, you will come to know whether your data is normally distributed or not. Small samples are, as a general rule, are not normally distributed. And there are formal tests to conduct the normality. I use a SPSS software. You can use anything you like, and you will come to know whether your data is normally distributed or not. So once you have identified your data is nominal or ordinal or categorical or a continuous data, whether it is paired or unpaired, whether it is normally distributed, that is parametric, or not normally distributed, that is non-parametric, and whether your what is your data, you can apply a test. So let's see how do you apply or choose a statistical test. So if you see, to apply a statistical test, you need to answer 3 questions, which you have already done in your, I believe sir has already covered in the methodology section. What is the question? Is your question descriptive? You are asking like, what is the type of blood pressure for a people in a given population? That means there is no groups. There is one population, and you are comparing this cohort that you have chosen with the data that is available on the web of a general population. That is the comparison you are doing. Then there is a group difference, like there are 2 groups or 3 groups where you have done an intervention. There is a cause and effect relation that you want to find out. And the third is the correlational or the predictive nature of the question. You want to predict whether this giving a drug will happen that, or if you do an investigation, whether it will predict it or not. So these are the 3 basic questions that you will ask. There are other questions, obviously, to screen, to find the risk factors and other things, but I'll come across that. These are the 3 basic questions that you will come across while choosing a test. So let's go one by one, all 3 of them. If this one sample test, or which is the descriptive test, that you have got just one cohort, it's very rare in a scientific research that you choose one sample. That is, it's just an observational study of a one population or one cohort. These are rarely being used nowadays. But still, I'll say that one sample test, if your data is nominal or continuous, you do a one sample test, which compares the mean of a sample to the mean of a general population of the same cohort, which is known actually and is there in the literature. So, for example, you know that the average birth, let's say, you know that the average birth weight of Indian babies is 3.4 grams, and you choose to weigh the birth of the babies in your hospital, and you compare them with the given data. So that is one sample test. Similarly, if your data is ordinal, let's say the age of the children, the median age known is like 8 years, and you want to know the age of the children suffering from a particular disease in your hospital, and you collect those data and compare with it with the given literature, it's one sample median test. Similarly, categorical with 2 levels, yes or no, dichotomous variables, you have got binomial test, and more than 2, it's chi-square. So this kind of research is very rare to come by. What we generally try and research, or what we generally come across, are the second and the third question. That is the group differences, in which most of us choose a particular intervention and divide the cohort in 2 groups or 3 groups and see the effect of the intervention. I think that is the most common that is being used. Don't get perturbed by this slide, which is filled with images. I'll just make it simpler. Okay, so if your data is qualitative, as I said, qualitative data could be it could be yes or no, or gender, male or female, or it could be anything, mortality, yes or no, something like that. So you have a qualitative data in hand, and you have either 1 group, 2 group, 3 groups. It doesn't make a difference. You apply a chi-square test. Simply go ahead and apply a chi-square test. But given the caveat that your sample size is more than 5. If your sample size is very, very small, there are some rare incidences, or very rare research where you will be dealing with patients like transplant, and you want to do some research. You won't find many transplant happening in your hospital, and then your sample size would be like less than 5. You can go for Fisher exact test. So that's the difference between a chi-square and choosing a Fisher exact. But in totality, you have a qualitative data in hand, we choose a chi-square test. Absolutely go ahead with it. Coming on, I'll come to the examples of each one of them in the next slide. So we'll revise them once again. So let's say if you have got 2 groups, you intervene and you want to see the difference of your intervention as the outcome variable in 2 groups. So data you have could be unpaired, or it could be paired. Unpaired and paired, as I said, it could be, you can decide what you have, and then you can use a t-test, unpaired or paired t-test. But let's say if your data is skewed and or not following a normal distribution, then you apply a Mann-Whitney U-test if it's a unpaired data, and you use a Wilcoxon signed rank test if it is a paired variable. There are 2 more things that is there. One is the McNemer. McNemer is a counterpart of paired t-test for a qualitative data. That is the only caveat here. Now let's say if you have got more than 2 groups, that is 3 or more groups, then you do one-way ANOVA, which is for an unpaired parametric test. But if for any matter you have unequal variance, now this is a new term which has come, assume equal variance, yes or no. What is a variance? If you have equal number of data points, or the numbers in the 2 groups are nearly the same, then you should be able to safely say that the 2 sample tests are for equal variance. If I'm not clear, I will simplify this. Let's say in one group you have got 20 patients, and in another group you have got 18 patients. So they are nearly normal. This is this you can assume a equal variance, or for that matter. But let's say if one of the groups has got, you have collected data of variable for 50, there are 50 data points, and in another group you have got only 10 data points. So there is a lot of difference in the variance between the 2. And then you have to choose a test which does not assume equal variance, like Kruskal-Wallis or Friedman. So that's the difference between assuming an equal variance and not assuming an equal variance. I'll simplify more of this in the next slide, in which I will deal with the example. Let's say this is the example. Let's say I have applied 2 intervention. In one of the group, babies in the post-operative period is given high flow nasal cannula through airvo, and in another there is nasal intermittent ventilation by a nasal CPAP mask. So I want to see what is the difference. So if the data of gender, you want to see how many males are there in the first group and how many males are there in the second group, and you want to compare them, this is a qualitative data. You go for a chi-square test if the sample size is more than 5. If sample size is less than 5, you go for Fisher exact test. Let's say you have got age in months between the two groups, you want to compare them. This is a quantitative data. This is an unpaired or student t-test. And if the data is non-parametric or not following normal distribution, that means if the age of the patient in any of the group is conglomerating at a certain point, let's say more than half of the patient are less than 1 year of age and other half is distributing from 1 year to 14 years of age. So there is a lot of differences and it is not normally distributed. You choose a Mann-Whitney U test when the data is not normally distributed, or what we call as non-parametric test in a quantitative variable. Let's say you want to compare SpO2, that is the pulse oximetry before and after application of these devices in the two groups. So you have got, these are paired data. Paired data because they are equal in number, you will have got equal number of SpO2 data before and equal number of SpO2 data after. They are correlated to each other. So it's a paired quantitative data, and you do a paired t-test. But if it is not normally distributed, as I said, you will choose a Wilcoxon sign rank test. These tests are easy to apply in any software you choose, and but then you need to know which test you need to apply. Let's say you want to see that what is the satisfaction of the child, whatever scale you choose, and you see the satisfaction level of the child, whether yes or no. That is a dichotomous variable. There are only two variables, yes or no. That is after and before. So there is a child satisfaction scoring after and before application of the device in two groups. So what test you choose is a McNemer test. And let's say you add another group, and the third group is receiving a nasal cannula through a oxygen flow meter, through either a cylinder or a manual or a wall fitted thing. And there are now three groups to compare for the same data. So let's say you have got age in months to compare for all three groups. So this is a quantitative data. There is more than two groups. You choose a one-way ANOVA. And if it is not normally distributed, as I said, if it is skewed somewhere, you choose a Kruskal-Wallis test. So it just, if you know which test to apply, the software is so easy and to use that you can apply the test. And this is the last example which I said. Let's say you want to know the PO2 values or in all the three groups or in two groups in which you have got repeated sampling. Let's say pre-operative, post-operative, day 1 and day 2. So you have got PO2 values of patients which have been multiple times taken. And you want to see whether these PO2 values are related with the outcome of the patient or related with the intervention that you have done. So this is a repeated measure ANOVA. And if it is not normally distributed, as I said, you can use a Friedman test. So easy to see that you can apply a test depending if you know what data you have in hand. If you know those questions, it is a qualitative or a quantitative, it is a paired or an unpaired, whether it is two groups or more than two groups. And these kind of questions, if you are able to answer, it is very easy to choose what kind of test to apply. Now coming on to the third question, that is the correlational or the predictive design of the study. So this is a very simple table that I have made myself. So if you have got one dependent variable and one independent variable, that is you intervene and you see the effect. There is one intervention and there is one outcome. So you choose to see the association between two, that you do a correlation. Some people might ask, why don't you do a t-test in this? But t-test will show you the, will compare the mean between the two variables. But correlation is something which you define as, it will show you the association between the cause and the effect. It will not test the means, but it will test also the association between the two variables. That's the difference between a correlation and a simple t-test. Now, if you have got a qualitative data, like a male or a female on one outcome, then you do a simple logistic regression. And similarly, if you have got more than two interventions, like or more than two independent variables, like age and weight, So you want to see how age and weight both has an effect on the outcome. That is one dependent variable. So you choose a multiple regression, and qualitative data, you choose a multiple logistic regression. And if you have got more than one dependent variable, that is more than one outcome. Let's say you want to see the what is the effect of age and weight on length of stay in the ICU and mechanical ventilation duration both, then you choose a multivariate multiple logistic regression. I will explain this to you in the next slide in the similar fashion, where two groups are chosen and intervention is done in two groups and you want to see. So age with outcome, you do a correlation. The intervention that you do, and you choose to do it with a length of stay. So it is a simple logistic regression because the intervention is a qualitative data and age is a continuous quantitative data. Now, if you want to see the effect of inspiration oxygen on two outcomes, that is more than one dependent variable. These are dependent variable, length of stay and mechanical ventilation duration. So you do a ordered regression. And if you want to see various factors that is associated with length of stay, you do a multiple regression. So there are ways and means to choose a test if you know your data very well. And there are just two more slides which I will go through. This is statistics which analyze clinical investigations, which you will find everywhere. If you want to screen, it is mainly used for screening of an investigation for a and you do a positive, negative predictive value, sensitivity. I will not go in detail. And then you have got statistics which compare risks. So you have got patients who have been exposed or treated and the outcome, and you can find the relative risk and odds ratio. So these are the only simpler, broad ways by which you can analyze your data. There are many caveats to it, but I will just finish my talk here because it will be too long. And a number of things you should consider before selecting a test. Assumptions must be satisfied. You can look for assumptions in whichever software you choose, and result must be interpreted cautiously because the software will give you data, and to interpret that result, it has to be with caution. And with that, I will end my talk and I will stop sharing. Thank you so much.
Dr. Sethi, unmute yourself, sir.
Okay. I would like to thank all the three speakers for a very simple, clear, and a very lucid exposition of a difficult topic. I think it was very well done. We have a few questions which have come up, and if it's okay, we'll quickly take those questions now so that we keep within the time frame. The first question is for Dr. Garg.
Sir.
Dr. Garg, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there, sir.
Absolutely. So the question is, why do we reject the null hypothesis and not say accepting the alternative hypothesis?
I think this is an important question. Initially, it started with, if you remember, I used some terms, the level of significance. We usually take 5% and then say the null hypothesis is rejected and the alternate hypothesis is accepted. The reason is clear. It has been taken up by conventional, because if something does not exist in this world, we do not need to prove that thing, because this will be, it is not desirable. So conventionally it started with it that we create a null hypothesis and saying that the difference does not exist, and then reject it and then accept the alternate hypothesis. So this was by conventional started the process of null hypothesis, and in certain situation we can go for then we can go for the acceptance of the alternate hypothesis. So this is more or less a conventional way.
Yeah, that's right. It's more or less a convention, as quite a few aspects in medical practice. The next questions, we have a couple of them for Dr. Rakhi. Dr. Rakhi, the first question is regarding the CTRI. Do we require a CTRI registry even for observational studies?
These days, the CTRI is required for publication purpose in most reputed journals, in most index journals. We, with GOCP also, we ask for CTRI registration simply because it adds to the authenticity, it adds to the protection of human rights. So it's important. And there is no harm getting it done. Ideally, CTRI, there are lots of questions on CTRI, the
Yeah.
registration, so I think I can take them together.
Yeah,
The whole
I'll keep telling you. Okay.
Yes. So the whole concept of CTRI was to register a trial, so in public domain. Right. It was meant for the pharmaceutical companies so that when they test a drug, they should not do it hush hush in one corner and unleash it on the poor patients. But if you are testing, and they say off-label use of drugs do not require observational studies do not require, but on ground, every study requires a registration. Because when you submit it for publication, they ask you for the registration number. And if you don't have any, now you can't do anything about it because it has to be done before the start of the study, before recruiting the
yes.
first patient. It's a prospective registration.
And Dr. Raki, what about retrospective trials? That's another question. Do they need to be registered too?
It has to be registered first and then the trial has to occur. It can't be a
So a retrospective trial, by definition, then may not really, have that much of credence in a reputed journal.
No, not at all. They will not take it, sir.
Yeah. So
The
that is the bottom
CTRI
line.
will not register. I've tried it. Trust
Yeah.
me, I've tried
So,
myself
yes.
that I
So,
did the study.
so
Now I
that's a
want to
catch.
register. They will not register.
There's another question regarding the CTRI. Can one have the same registry for two related trials?
No, sir. Absolutely not.
Absolutely.
You have to stick to your title. They check they give you a number for a particular title. Even one word goes out of place as per the protocol you have submitted, you cannot.
So
if you want to make a
yes.
change in your existing protocol, say you planned something but it's not possible to do this, like this pandemic happened, so the previous study may not be feasible in the current scenario, then you can ask for a change. Maybe they give, but for two studies, no.
But the same thing I think will the same premise may apply for extending the duration of a study. I think you'll have to apply.
Yes.
And then, like you say, you may get it, or it may take a long time to come through it.
Yes.
But you have to apply for it.
So if I may add to this, this question generally arises when people are doing a research and they have got, like, let's say, two papers coming out of the same data collected. Correct. So that's also incorrect, I would say, or unethical. For a single data, you have to have a single paper. If you are using the same data for two papers, it is not correct or not ethical. Otherwise, you will have to get a separate clearance of it. And nowadays, it is not encouraged to take two papers from the same data.
It's very clear, sir. The journal editor opens the CTRI. When the moment you put the number, they open and read it. So you can't mess up with it.
There's another question, Raki, on ethical clearance. Is it required for clinical practice surveys also?
Yes, sir. Because people think that I'm just asking questions, but then the anonymity may not be there. If I say it's come from this particular area, say in Delhi, so some patients may be affected in some way. Suppose they're collecting data on tuberculosis in South Delhi. So some symptomatic people in South Delhi may feel offended. So it's a matter of human rights. All surveys should also be ethically cleared because you are using their data. It should be.
It is very clear that all studies or data or collections related to human beings should be having an ethical approval. I think this is in a nutshell.
Absolutely. No, and there's another corollary to this. One of the audiences asked, is ethical clearance, should the CTI registration follow the ethical clearance or vice versa?
So the ethical clearance is taken first
Yeah, so
by the
that is rather
Institutional
wrong.
Ethics Committee
Absolutely.
and then CTRI registration, because CTRI asks you for the ethic clearance. Without that, you cannot register your trial.
You
Yeah,
have to upload the
absolutely.
ethical letter.
And you can either have your own institutional, or if you don't have that, then you can apply to the external ethical committee.
Yes.
Would you be knowing the composition? One of the questions is the composition of the external ethics committee.
It's the same, sir. It's the same. Like a typical ethics committee has 2-3 clinicians, one or two people from the basic medical sciences, one legal expert,
And
one
it would be
ethical
published. It would be published
paper.
by the
Similar.
CTRI. Okay.
And these ethics committee, wherever you have, they're registered ethics committee. You can't have 10 people who have decided, okay, let's form an ethics committee. No, this has to be registered with DCGI, and then your ethics committee is valid.
Okay. Another question now. This is for Dr. Alok. How does a hospital register for a multi-centric trial?
There are two ways to register for a multi-center trial. First of all, if each center has got their own institutional ethical board, they can clear their institutional ethical committee, or they can apply at the same time to the central ethical committee and get an application. And then one person who is the so-called chosen, or whose research is it, he can register that study with the ethical clearance in the CTRI. That's how you register a multi-center study. But ethical clearance for all institute is mandatory, whether separately or centrally. It has to be taken. It cannot be taken at one center and then distributed to all centers. That is the crux.
Okay. There are two more basic questions. One is, how does one eliminate bias? And
Okay.
yes.
Bias, as we spoke through the study, at every stage of the study, at every step, there could be a bias, starting from how you choose your patient population, how you randomize them, how you allocate them, the group, how you perform, how you collect data. So every stage has a bias, scope of bias. So you have to prevent this bias at every step of your study.
Okay. And there's another question. Can you just tell us in a nutshell what is specificity and what is sensitivity? Yeah, Dr. Alok, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I think this is a very basic question where you are doing a test like a screening test to rule out a disease or to confirm a disease. Now the test could give you a true positive result, a false positive result, or a true negative or a false negative result. That's how a cross tabs is made 2 into 2 cross table with degree of freedom of 2. So if you make that table, and it's very easy to see the sensitivity or specificity. Sensitivity is something, I'll give you a crux, that the sensitivity is something which tells you that more and more people will be tested positive and will be labeled as diseased, while specificity is something in which the screening will be very stringent and the true positive will be very, very high. So if the test is positive, the disease is there.
Okay.
But sensitivity, if test is positive, no people is true negative would be there, but lot of people with false negative would fall in the sensitivity.
So that's absolutely right. So I'll just clarify this a little bit more. A very sensitive test will have very few false negatives, and a very specific test will have very few false positives. That means the type 1 error or false positive will be less, and a type 2 error or a false negative will be less accordingly. Okay. So sensitivity and specificity are terms which we use quite often in statistics. So I think that more or less covers the questions which had come up today. There's a couple of more, but I think keeping in view the time, Dr. Garg, what do you feel? It's been It's been a long day.
I'll just, Dr. Sarvini Swaika is with us. She is the Vice President of
Oh, lovely. Yes.
RSCCP.
Oh, that's
So
very
I will
nice.
request Madam to give a couple of encouraging words to us, to the
Excellent.
society. And
That's
she
right.
is
That's very
really
nice.
working very good amount for the growth of our society.
Okay.
Dr. Swaika, Madam, please.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Ma'am, can you unmute yourself? You're muted, ma'am.
Yes, am I audible now? Hello?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Dr. Rakesh Garg. Very good evening
Madam,
to all of you.
can you unmute
I'm
yourself,
very
ma'am?
sorry.
Your voice is not
Yes.
coming.
And she's fine now.
Yeah, it's fine.
Is it okay now?
Yes,
Okay,
ma'am,
ma'am.
it's
Okay,
fine.
go ahead.
Yes, very good evening to all of you. I apologize first to come and join late for today's webinar. I'm so very thankful to you all to serve this society as Vice President, especially our President, Dr. S.P. Sharma, President-elect, Dr. Indrani Hemant Kumar, and our dynamic Secretary, Dr. Naveen Malhotra, and all of you sitting here. So I would like to welcome all the DC members, eminent speakers, as it is already over, and delegates present at today's webinar. I think everybody has enjoyed the webinar, this scientific session. We all know that the entire globe is faced with the duress of the coronavirus. And during hard times such as these, only we can really do is to adapt ourselves to reach a collaborative goal for the society. And we know that our vision, the RSSCP's vision, is to promote, acknowledge, appreciate, and award the scientific research, presentation, and publications in anesthesiology and its various specialities. During this pandemic, what we can do, we have started our scientific program through webinars since 1st July 2020 to achieve this goal of RSSCP and to promote knowledge and knowledge sharing. So I wish from my heart all the success for these webinars, which allow us to learn during these critical times. I hope that each one present here, you are attending this scientific meeting from the comfort of your home, gains something from today's sessions. Thank you all. Thank you again. My sincere thanks to everyone present here, and hope each and everyone is following the guidelines to stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. And I would like to thank all the speakers for an excellent job. Well done. And to the audience for being such attentive and interactive listeners. Thank you, everybody. Jai Hind.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was great.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you,
Okay.
the RSSCP Governing Council, the Secretary, President, Vice President for the good support and taking it forward. I hope it is useful to the participants. And last word, concluding statement from Dr. Naveen Malhotra, sir.
Yes.
All the webinar speakers were excellent. Well done. Thumbs up.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you, sir.
Take care. Long live RSCP. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank
Long
you.
live RSCP. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, long live.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, I don't know. Oh, what are you? She's, hello. Chalo, wonderful. Left. Recording. No. What's wrong?
Thank you very much, everyone. Yes, really, very excellent webinar.